Welcome to Virginia Community Capital's Top 6 PPP Forgiveness Reminders, where we are going to present 6 reminders for borrowers preparing their forgiveness applications. Reminder number 1. Let's talk about the forgiveness applications. The SBA has issued 2 forms for borrowers to use, 3508 Full Form and 3508 Easy Short Form. Form 3508 Easy is a short form that allows borrowers to make certain certifications and provide less documentation regarding full-time equivalent employees. To ease some stress, we urge every borrower to check their qualification for the 3508 Easy before completing any PPP forgiveness application. After reviewing the 3508 Easy, if you do not qualify to use the form, then you will be required to complete the full 3508. If you are using the full 3508, start by filling out the PPP Schedule A worksheet. Then move to the Schedule A, and finally use the Schedule A to complete the application. Reminder number 2. Remember to review the instructions for the form you are completing. The instructions for the 3508 and 3508 EZ are listed separately from the forms on the Treasury website, on the SBA's website, and on VCC's website as well. Please remember to download the instructions as well as the form, as the instructions provide the key information to completing your forgiveness application, as well as information regarding the documentation that must be provided with the application to validate the calculations. Reminder number 3, supporting documentation. Each forgiveness application instructions outline specific documentation that must be supplied to support inputs. Borrowers need to provide documentation of the amount of PPP funds used on eligible payroll and non-payroll expenses. Remember, at least 60% of the funds must be used for payroll. Let's take a look at the required documentation. $3508 payroll. Documentation verifying the eligible cash compensation and non-cash benefit payments from the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period, consisting of each of the following. Bank account statements or third-party payroll service provider reports documenting the amount of cash compensation paid to employees. Tax forms or equivalent third-party payroll service provider reports for the periods that overlap with the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period. This includes payroll tax filings reported or that will be reported to the IRS, state quarterly business and individual employee wage reporting and unemployment insurance tax filings reported, or that will be reported to the relevant state. Payments, canceled checks, or account statements documenting the amount of any employer contributions to the employee health insurance and retirement plans that the borrower included in the forgiveness amount. The required payroll documentation for Form 3508 EZ is pretty much the same as the full 3508, with one exception. If you checked only the second box on the checklist on page 1 of the instructions, The average number of full-time equivalent employees on payroll employed by the borrower on January 1st, 2020, and at the end of the covered period must be provided. Now let's talk about eligible non-payroll expenses. The first thing to remember is that if you use PPP funds for non-payroll expenses like mortgage interest payments, rent or lease payments, or utility payments, you must provide business mortgage insurance payments, copy of lender amortization schedule, and receipts or canceled checks verifying eligible payments from the covered period, or lender account statements from February 2020 and the months of the covered period through 1 month after the end of the covered period, verifying interest amounts and eligible payments. Business rent or lease payments, a copy of the current lease agreement, and receipts or canceled checks verifying eligible payments from the covered period, or lesser account statements from February 2020 and from the covered period through 1 month after the end of the covered period, verifying eligible payments. For business utility payments, copy of invoices from February 2020 and those paid during the covered period, and receipts, canceled checks, or account statements verifying those eligible payments. The next documentation requirement is for borrowers using the full 3508 FTE documentation. If you are using the full 3508, you will be required to provide documentation on your full-time equivalent employees for a period prior to the covered period. The acceptable periods are the average number of FTE employees on payroll per week employed by the borrower between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019. Or the average number of FTE employees on payroll per week employed by the borrower between January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020. Or in the case of a seasonal employer, the average number of FTE employees on payroll per week employed by the borrower between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019. Between January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020, or any consecutive 12-week period between May 1st, 2019 and September 15th, 2019. What documentation should you provide? Documentation similar to the documentation like third-party payroll reports, tax forms, and pay stubs. Reminder number 4, expenses paid and or incurred. Whatever expenses are paid during the covered period, borrowers must provide proof from source to destination. Additionally, any payroll or non-payroll expenses must be either paid or incurred during the period. This includes non-cash compensation included in the payroll calculation, like employer-paid health insurance benefits and contributions to employee retirement plans, as well as expenses like utility and lease payments. What does this mean? Expense incurred prior to receiving PPP funds. Expense paid after receiving the PPP funds during the covered period. For example, if the coverage period began on April 20th and you had a payroll period end on April 18th and paid out payroll on April 24th, this is acceptable because it was paid during the covered period. Expense incurred during the covered period. Expense paid after the covered period ends, but before the next payment date. For example, if the coverage period ends on October 4th and the payroll period ended on October 4th, but payroll was not paid until the following Friday, October 9th, this is acceptable as it was incurred during the coverage period. Reminder number 5. There is some additional information that affects the documentation for eligible non-payroll expenses. Let's take a look. If you use PPP funds for any non-payroll expenses during the covered period, you must provide proof that they were in effect prior to February 15th, 2020. Additionally, please be aware that the alternative payroll coverage period does not apply to non-payroll expenses. All non-payroll expenses must be paid within the covered period that starts the day the PPP funds are received and ends within 8 or 24 weeks after receiving those funds. And remember, proof of expenses paid must be from source to destination. Our final reminder, number 6, is on owner's compensation. For owner employees with more than 5% ownership stake, there are caps on the amount of compensation that you can receive. For the 8-week period, the calculation is 8 divided by 52 of 2019 net profit or cash compensation, up to $15,385, whichever is lower. For the 24-week period, the calculation is 2.5 divided by 12 of 2019 net profit or cash compensation, up to $20,833, whichever is lower. Every owner should be mindful of these limits. Thank you for viewing VCC's top 6 PPP forgiveness reminders. PPP forgiveness resources can be found on our website or on the Treasury website. Please send any questions to ppp-forgiveness@vccva.org.